Hello, and welcome back to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon, and I'm really glad to be back. Thank you. Welcome to all of my new viewers, and let's kick off Season 3. This episode is actually a direct response to some questions that I got from viewers on understanding the Book of the Dead. First off, there's a couple of different copies that are out there. The Book of the Dead is actually the most commonly available of three sets of Egyptian texts. I'll get to that in a minute. The easiest one to get a hold of is this one. It's the Book of the Dead. Now it says under here, and this is important, the Papyrus of Ani by E.A. Wallace Budge. Just to say Budge, that's how most of us refer to it. This is the same thing, more or less, and it's translated by Raymond O. Faulkner. Budge here is cheap and easy. I got this one used on Amazon for a few bucks, and it's probably the most commonly available one. But the problem is, this translation is over 100 years old, and it's also incomplete. It says the Papyrus of Ani. It's only covering one example of the Book of the Dead. There are literally thousands of copies scattered in museums across the world. This copy of the book, modern book, is complete in that it has all 192 known chapters of the Book of the Dead. And it was also translated in, if I remember correctly, the 1970s. It's much more up to date, a little easier to read too. This one came as part of a kit that was like a Christmas promotion at Barnes & Noble. And so if you have a Barnes & Noble in your area, keep an eye out because they might have this, and it was about $15, so it's a really good way to get a copy of it that's, up to date, reliable, and, not too hard on the pocketbook. If you have the opportunity, there's another book, How to Read the Egyptian Book of the Dead by Barry Kemp. It's not a very thick book at all. You could read it in a day or so. It's very helpful for explaining some of the peculiarities of the Book of the Dead. The only problem is Barry Kemp is an Egyptologist who specializes in the Amarna period and Akhenaten and the city of Amarna. And so, when you work at a particular job, you kind of see everything through that filter. And so some of the interpretations that he takes on traditional mythology and things like that won't work very well for our purposes. But it's a good sort of a primer. So if you can get a hold of it, it's rather helpful. A little bit of background on the Book of the Dead. As I said, there are three very large collections of texts. The pyramid text is actually the oldest one. It's the oldest known religious literature. And these were texts that were carved in the walls of the pyramids during the 5th and 6th dynasty. Afterwards, you had what's called the coffin texts because they were most often found inscribed on coffins. They're sort of a descendant of the pyramid texts in that they use some of the same spells are there. There's some new ones, things that kind of build on themes from the pyramid texts. And then the Book of the Dead is a descendant of that, of the coffin texts. There are some texts that are, passages that are very similar, and if not the same as what was in the coffin texts. You can get the pyramid texts too. I have a copy of it in my library. Funny, the coffin texts are very hard to get a hold of. I've got it on my Amazon wish list, but it's $300 for 3 volumes. It's unfortunately right now kind of out of the range, out of the reach of anyone who's not a specialist. The Book of the Dead, however, it reflects the increasing importance of Ra and of Osiris that you had during the period that the coffin texts were written. And it's kind of interesting, there's sort of a throwback. If you think about the time that they were being used, which would have been the New Kingdom, think pharaohs like Amenhotep, Tutankhamun, Ramesses. Their time period is when the coffin text, or excuse me, the Book of the Dead was being used. But the thing is, it wasn't standardized until sometime later, or what we call the late period. Before then, you could have pretty much any number of texts that you wanted. There wasn't something that said, this is a complete set. it was almost like a shopping cart. You have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and that's something very important to keep in mind with the Book of the Dead. It's not a single narrative. You can't sit down and read it from cover to cover and go through a whole story or a whole theme. It kind of bounces back and forth. It's like looking in somebody's shopping cart and saying, oh, well, I've got a spell for this, I've got a spell for that, I've got, this hymn, and so on. Because it's just a collection of what people thought was important. Um, it also reflects a little bit about a lot actually, about the Egyptians' view of the afterlife. The Egyptians didn't see heaven and hell the way we do, which is, these polar opposites. The afterlife was kind of ambivalent. There were things about it that were good, there were things about it that were bad, just like, life for us. The kingdom of Osiris was all, you had the fields of peace, or the fields of offerings. It's how the name's been rendered, and that was a nice place. And if you got to, you know, come face to face with Osiris, that could be a good thing. But there were also demons and spirits and, ghosts of angry dead and things like that that could, roam the landscape of the afterlife, which they called Duat. Um, and you might run into one of those things. That's why they had so many spells. In fact, what I'm referring to as chapters, a lot of sources will call spells. You'll have spell number whatever, because you had spells for turning into a serpent or a crocodile or becoming a deity. And the reason why they had this, it kind of reflects a little bit about, our fears as humans about what happens when you die. What's going to happen to my body? Well, they've got a spell for that. There's a spell not to decay. There's a spell for your head not to be removed from your body. What if I run into a nasty demon or something? Well, there's the spell to become a crocodile immersed in dread, or to become any number of things. Um, and also fears, will I remember my human existence? Will I remember who I was after I die? They have spells for that too. Spells for not having your heart removed. Remember, the Egyptians saw the heart as the seat of intelligence. There were spells for seeing your house again. And those are very human feelings that we have as we sit and we think about something that, is really, um, it's, most would say, impossible to understand what happens after you die. And, you've got, the ghost hunter shows that are on TV now. That's another story entirely. But this is what the Egyptians had in place of that, and the spells that had to do with becoming a god, and there are quite a few of those had to do with taking on the power and the authority of that deity. And if you think about this, they lived in a monarchy. It was a feudal system. And so if you had the authority of such and such person, the ferryman on the sunbark, of Ra, then there was a certain amount of authority that came with that you could, so you wouldn't have anybody else bossing you around in the afterlife. Um, but I kind of liken this to like the Twilight Zone, if you remember the old theme to that, because the spells for becoming this, that, or the other are like the pit of man's fears. Uh, but the summit of the Egyptians' morality, if you will, was a particular chapter, and this is the one that I think most people are thinking about when they ask about the Book of the Dead. And that's chapter 125. That has the 42 statements that are called, depending on your source, either the negative confessions, the declarations of innocence, or there's one particular group that calls them the purifications. It's all the same thing. And these are addressed to various deities who were sort of like councilmen on the divine scale. And you would say, Hail, Bastet, who comes from Pibaset, I have not eavesdropped, I have not caused anyone to weep, I have, it goes through a whole list of things. Some of them are pretty straightforward. Things like, I have not killed anyone, I have not, snatched food from the infant. Some of them have to do with, religious purity. But this is what has most people, this is what captures our imagination about, the Book of the Dead and about the Egyptians' views of religion. What's interesting is there's an academic debate over the meaning of this chapter. Some people say, well, the Egyptians probably, held to this in life and expected to be judged on it when they died. But there's another train of thought that says, well, all of these things that were in the Book of the Dead were spells. They were meant to get you out of a predicament or to allow you to do a certain thing. Could it be that the chapter with the negative confessions is just a way of conning yourself into a good judgment, saying, oh, no, I haven't done any of this, and magically by saying so, it will be that you haven't done any of those things? Because if so, that's not a very, high-minded and moral point of view. Well, scholars don't have the position that we do. They can only argue the facts. It's up to us to decide what that means. And, that's why it's so important for us, why we sit here and we ponder, this particular chapter. What I think is interesting, though, there's another chapter, and keep in mind, the numbers that we've given them may have had no meaning, if you were to talk to an ancient Egyptian. They go, 125, well, I have that over here, this is at the beginning, or that's at the end. This is just the numbering that scholars have given it to make it easier to keep track of. But there's a chapter, it's chapter 14, for removing anger from the heart of the god. Hail to you, you who descend in power, chief of all secret matters. Behold, my word is spoken. So says the God who is angry with me. Wrong is washed away, and it falls immediately. O lords of justice, put an end to the evil harm which is in me. O you companions of the God of justice, may this God be gracious to me. May my evil be removed for you. O Lord of offerings, as mighty ruler, behold, I have brought to you a propitiation offering, so that you may live on it, and that I may live on it. Be gracious to me, and remove all anger which is in your heart against me. If you think about that, a propitiation offering, that means they're offering something to the god to make them, feel better and not be so angry about something. This could be the Egyptian equivalent of an act of contrition. Forgive me for what I have transgressed. I'm making this offering to make it right. And then you go on much later to be in the hall of two truths in front of Osiris and say, I have not done X, Y, and Z. So it may be that they also believe that if you had done something, you should try to put it right so that you could eventually reach to the point where you can say, I haven't done these things. Or if you had, you've made it right, which is the same as, clearing it from your record. So the Book of the Dead, it's not like literature that we're used to reading. Ancient literature speaks in a tone and using imagery that is not very familiar to our own modes of expression. Imagine how they would feel trying to read, somebody's post on a Twitter page. That would be pretty incomprehensible to them too. But as you're reading it, don't try to get too caught up in the symbolism of the animals and the images. I am the wild bull, I am the lotus, that comes in the form of Nefertum. A lot of it is related to mythology. And as I read the spells on becoming this, that, or the other, I try to find, what kind of references are there in these spells to different gods and goddesses, things that happened in their mythology. There's a couple of spells that have to do with the sons of Horus, and the way they're described, it almost sounds like the A-Team, because Kemetic and Duamutef are kept away somewhere, and they have to get them out because they're very contentious, and we can't let Set know about it, and, you really have to read it. It's very funny when you think about it. But there's also a few spells, if you look through, and by the way, go on Google Books. You can find Faulkner's translation. It's not going to be the whole book. They take out sections because they want you to buy it. But you can find a few. Chapters 133 through 136 actually talk about spells for things that should be said during certain phases of the moon. And that might be a clue as to what the Egyptians did to celebrate, lunar observances. So there's little things you can get in the Book of the Dead if you read it that can be of great value. But don't try to read the whole thing and go, oh my God, I didn't get this part. That's okay. Even the ancient Egyptians had that problem, because there's one chapter that has glosses That's what scholars call them. Where you have a passage that says, I am, Ra who came from Nun, and then it says, what does this mean? It means, and then they give an explanation. So even they had trouble with the text sometimes. So that should hopefully set your mind at ease. And hopefully this will give you some information and food for thought for your own practice. For the Kemetic How-To Guide, this is Sharon, wishing you Senebti.